To generalise, the last decade has been incredible for the Battlefield franchise. 6 full titles have launched since 2010, and the ride along the way, I always describe it as a rollercoaster ride. It's been full of ups, downs, highs and lows. I personally believe this past decade has been the best that Battlefield has ever been, and I think it's important that we all remember what has come and gone. Some extremely important moments in the franchise's history were made in the last 10 years. We start off our decade-long journey in March 2010 with Battlefield Bad Company 2. At the time, many critics were hailing this game as better and more engaging than the juggernaut that was the Modern Warfare sub-franchise of Call of Duty, so that's some pretty high praise for Bad Company 2. The multiplayer segments were somewhat scaled back from the 64-player chaos that's normally associated with the Battlefield franchise, but that combined with the continuation of the single-player story of Bad Company, Haggard, Sweetwater, Redford and Marlowe, I think that set up Bad Company 2 as the cult classic that it's viewed as today. Bad Company 2 distilled the chaotic action of Battlefield multiplayer down into a more linear, more focused offering, where the Rush game mode that first debuted 2 years earlier in the previous entry took centre stage. And I think it did a fantastic job at connecting fans to specific maps and experiences. Being a Bad Company 2 child myself, I align with the Rush game mode, and I hold it as the best game mode that Battlefield offers. It shaped me as a player of Battlefield games, always being focused on objectives, aggressively pushing up and making risky moves in order to gain a little bit more ground, being more concerned about just cutting down the infantry defense rather than engaging that scary looking tank at the back of the map. Bad Company 2 molded me into an infantry-focused Battlefield player, and I'm still that player today, and I think many other players are that way inclined too. Bad Company 2 really solidified the mentality that Battlefield didn't always have to be 64-player conquest to be entertaining, and that smaller, more focused experiences worked just as well. And then there's the icing on the cake, the Vietnam expansion. It completely converted Bad Company 2 from modern war and took us all the way back to the 1960s and the 1970s with an attitude that really just stuck 2 fingers up at what had happened before and just did whatever it wanted to do instead. That expansion was a labour of love for Bad Company 2. Instead of continuing to deliver single-player maps converted to support multiplayer combat, the DICE team took the time to craft almost what could have been a brand new Battlefield game, and they sold it as a DLC for a game that already had a very strong, dedicated player base. We might not have realised it at the time, but that move with the Vietnam DLC, that signalled DICE's future vision for how they'd handle their DLC expansions for future Battlefield games. Those DLCs completely changing up the feeling with each delivery. Moving forwards to 2011, the Battlefield franchise hit new heights with the announcement and the release of Battlefield 3. A signal that DICE was serious about this game was that they'd chosen to number it Battlefield 3, making it the true successor to Battlefield 2. Now, a lot had changed since Battlefield 2 was the game leading the charge, and number 3 couldn't have been any more different if it tried. The speed of gameplay was just off the charts in comparison to previous entries. You had players scampering around the halls of the Paris metro, they were throwing grenades down the alleyways of Grand Bazaar, they were firing RPGs at helicopters on the cliffs of Damavand Peak, and they were dogfighting in jets above the antenna of Caspian Border. Battlefield 3 was the next-generation modern shooter that was built to show off and deliver on the Battlefield vision. It was just all-out warfare. I think the game built on the infantry focus of Bad Company 2 somewhat, but DICE ended up throwing back in a bunch of stuff they removed from that spin-off, and everything just got amped back up to 11. 64-player all-out war combat was the order of the day. The exposure of Battlefield 3 to the first-person shooter scene was one that Battlefield as a franchise had not really experienced before, and it was a game where DICE really hit home on their technological advancements through the Frostbite engine. The destruction, that was refined from the more freeform days of Bad Company. Audio was designed to be immersive, and it built up an atmosphere that was almost unrivaled by anything else. Realistic soldier animations that reacted to the recoil of guns being fired. You had these huge scaled maps and environments creating massive battlegrounds, and you had a step forwards in the areas of lighting, and just general overall graphical fidelity. Battlefield 3 was a huge step forwards in terms of quality. It pretty much blew everything else away at the time. And Battlefield 3 only got better with time. The DLCs produced and released for the game really did follow in the footsteps of that Vietnam expansion for Bad Company 2. They changed up the feeling of the game completely. Close Quarters in mid-2012, that delivered micro-destruction and smaller maps that crunched Battlefield 3's infantry down into the smallest of spaces. Then you had Armored Kill, that blew everything up to the largest scale that we'd ever seen in a Battlefield game. Aftermath channeled this post-disaster vibe and introduced the improvised crossbow, which, at the time, was a weapon that pretty much all games on the scene seemed to be adding. And then we finished up with Endgame, which was a collaboration between DICE and Visceral Games that cemented Battlefield Hardline into the lineup for the future of the franchise. Battlefield 3 was an incredible game, and it took the franchise to new heights. It made people sit up and pay attention to what DICE was doing. Now, if Battlefield 3 was a step forward for the franchise, then I think it can be very easily argued that Battlefield 4 took the franchise backwards for a while, before making one of the most unlikely comebacks. In 2013, DICE released Battlefield 4 Into the World, and immediately there were issues. With the game being another fully fledged behemoth, a mainline entry into the franchise releasing just 2 years after Battlefield 3, perhaps DICE was a bit too optimistic with their ambition to deliver a solid experience with that game so soon. Coinciding with the launch of the next generation of consoles, perhaps another reason that the game suffered so badly to begin with, Battlefield 4 basically became the butt of every broken game joke for some time. Netcode issues, game crashes with no explanation, servers crashing, poor performance, the list goes on. It's not like other Battlefield games that had come before this one didn't have their own issues, but Battlefield 4 had been marketed with such fanfare and confidence that when these issues became apparent, the backlash really wasn't that difficult to understand. After a troubled launch and a rough ride into 2014, DICE made a decision at the time that seemed like an admittance to players that they needed some help. But by the end of the game's life cycle, it had become apparent that that decision was inspired, and it proved pivotal to the game's resurgence and success. DICE announced the Community Test Environment, a separate area of Battlefield 4 that would allow DICE to make sure that their bug fixes worked, that their new features were performing as expected, and as a bonus, players would get hands-on with new content a little bit earlier. It was basically a win-win for everyone involved, provided that the community was happy to be the public testers. And it turned out that they were more than happy to do that. The Dragon's Teeth and Final Stand DLCs, they were tested here, along with major netcode improvements and other bug fixes. And moving into 2015, the place became a testbed for brand new content outside of the advertised slate of content for Battlefield 4. 2015 became the year of unplanned content support, and arguably, it was the best time to be part of Battlefield 4's community. We received the Operation Outbreak map, a map made entirely from community input, a remake of the classic Battlefield 2 map Dragon Valley, and a night conversion of Zavod 311 named Zavod Graveyard Shift. This was alongside continued performance improvements and some new weapons as well. DICE had pretty much converted Battlefield 4 from a smouldering wreck into perhaps the most feature-packed shooter on the market at that time. And whatever you think about Battlefield 4, whether you still think that the game wasn't really a success because of the amount of issues it did have, it was an incredible achievement to go from that point where the game was so broken and not working properly to the point where it is now considered, still to this day, one of the best shooters of all time. That's an incredible achievement from DICE. While all of this extended work was going on with Battlefield 4, however, in 2014, EA and Visceral Games announced Battlefield Hardline, a spin-off title from the main franchise that took the fighting to the streets of Los Angeles in a conversion from military combat to police activity. Building on the base provided by Battlefield 4, Hardline tried to expand what Battlefield could be, but ultimately it failed to engage players long term. Despite selling fairly well and meeting sales targets set by EA, the premium DLC support for the game saw less and less people logging into play, and I include myself in that number. Hardline was not the success that EA had planned for it to be, and it just didn't hit the right note with players. And that led to DICE stepping up their support for Battlefield 4 and running that game in parallel with Hardline up until the end of 2015. Many players just felt that Hardline should have been a Battlefield 4 expansion, rather than its own title. And now we move into 2016. This is the year that Battlefield decided to turn back the clock a little bit. After 7 years of games being set in modern times or near future, stretching back to the release of Battlefield 1943 in 2009, DICE announced and released Battlefield 1. In the year that Activision announced their third jetpack exosuit shooter in a row, Infinite Warfare, EA and DICE received huge interest in their historical shooter that took us back to World War I, an era rarely explored by game developers. The reveal trailer became the most liked video game trailer ever released on YouTube, and it exploded Battlefield onto the screens of nearly every gamer, whether they liked first-person shooters or not. Battlefield 1 came as a complete surprise and took the gaming world by storm. Once again, DICE stepped up their presentation with the game, introducing a new look for Battlefield games with improved graphical fidelity, refinements to audio, animations, and destruction in the multiplayer setting. On the face of it, Battlefield 1 was a huge success for EA and DICE, and there is no denying that the community that built around that game loved it for what it was. But perhaps the biggest impact anything from Battlefield 1 had on the entire franchise was the addition of a brand new gameplay experience, Operations. Building on the success of Rush in previous games, Operations replaced the MCOM stations with flag capture points, it implemented linear sector-based combat, and it also updated the official player count to 64, so that made it a landmark Battlefield experience. Operations was built to simulate these huge pushes of manpower made during the Great War, fighting it out for the smallest scraps of land. The Kaiserschlacht, which is the operation that combined the St. Quentin, Scar, and Amiens maps, that was perhaps the greatest on offer. You started fighting in the dirty trenches of the French countryside, and you ended up in the streets of a large town. So that moved the warfare through varying combat distances and locations. Operations was a revolutionary game mode, and it became the centerpiece experience in Battlefield 1. However, after launch, attitudes towards the game started to change a little bit. Battlefield 1 in itself changed a lot of what was core to the Battlefield experience, and it took the franchise in a slightly different direction. Gone were the third-party rental servers, replaced with a bare-bones in-house attempt by the DICE development team. Conquest scoring was changed to remove the tug-of-war element. Rush had been butchered with the implementation of artillery strikes and reduced to just 24 players maximum. The gunplay wasn't very satisfying due to the time period. The appearance of vehicles wasn't as great as had come before in previous games like Battlefield 4. And perhaps the most important point, the lack of content in the base game and the wait for content to arrive after launch. It took DICE 6 months to deliver their first DLC, They Shall Not Pass, bringing the French army into the game. It was then another 6-month wait for the Russians to arrive after that. DICE bungled the post-launch release schedule for the game, and that seriously hurt player retention. Control of the DLC schedule and content was passed over to DICE LA after the French DLC, and despite the DLCs being produced there adding a variety of new content, none of them really succeeded to capture the same essence as the DLCs for Battlefield 3 or Battlefield 4, where those really changed up the gameplay and gave you a different feeling. Each DLC here in Battlefield 1 largely felt the same, and it didn't really succeed in bolstering the game in any way. Battlefield 1 had an incredible start, but it faded pretty fast, and it seemed at the time that DICE wasn't quite sure how to stop the mass exodus of players. And then we come to 2018 and Battlefield 5. Now, considering we're still living with this game at the moment, it is the active Battlefield game at the end of the decade, it is hardly worth me repeating everything that I've been saying for the last 12 months in this video, so I'll summarise as best as I can. Battlefield 5 is perhaps the most polarising game that DICE has released in the decade, despite being the return to World War II that DICE was championing during their exceptionally poor marketing of this game. A reveal trailer with out-of-place cosmetic adjustments and a lack of thumping Battlefield music really set the tone, and the game never recovered from that point. Some highlights are the more brutal combat with the inclusion of a completely redesigned gunplay system, or at least that was the case until just recently when DICE decided to completely destroy it and replace it with a system they felt would make the game easier for new players, ignoring the dedicated players in the process. The Pacific Theater being added was also a highlight, adding a slew of new content to a World War II game, and that DLC definitely had the effect that I spoke about previously with the Vietnam DLC for Bad Company 2. The Pacific expansion for Battlefield 5 massively changed up the game. It made it feel like a World War II game. Up until that point, Battlefield 5 had not really felt like a World War II game. But players had to wait for nearly a year for that to be added to the game, and they had to endure a bunch of other horrific missteps along the way. The addition of a badly executed co-op mode, a fairly decent Battle Royale experience in Firestorm, but it ultimately wasn't handled properly after its launch, and it's almost completely faded away now, and a cancelled 5v5 mode that had been in development for a seriously long time, since the days of Battlefield 1 and the Incursions mode that DICE trialled there. To be totally honest, Battlefield 5 has been a huge disappointment from the start, and despite some elements shining through, like the Pacific Theater and the Operation Underground map, the game has failed to capture the hearts and the minds of Battlefield fans in the way previous franchise entries did. We're seeing a similar scenario to Battlefield 4, where the game is now needing to be rebuilt by the DICE development team, and the community needs to be rebuilt as well. But with Battlefield 5, I'm not getting the same feeling that I did with Battlefield 4's revival. It's true that Battlefield 5 is a much better game than what it was 12 months ago, but DICE keeps shooting themselves in the foot. For example, they announced in the spring that they were going to make the evolution of the rental server program, but the system they ended up launching doesn't even have the same basic, low-level functionality as the previous system. And the previous system was also a poor attempt at mimicking the system that was in place before. They announced they're bringing the Pacific Theater to the game, only then to ruin the gunplay experience and put a sour taste in all of the mouths of dedicated players who've endured 12 months of disappointment, with the only decent part of that being the gunplay experience. They announced that the game will be funded by the sale of cosmetics through microtransactions, but all of those cosmetics will be earnable via grinding. Awesome. But then they go back on their word and they make top-tier cosmetics only available if you spend real money, angering fans in the process. Battlefield 5 was, and still is to a certain extent, a mess. I still don't believe that the DICE team behind the game is united in their vision of what the game is and what it's going to be moving forwards. Decisions appear to be made without proper thought, without regard for community reaction, and without regard for the image of the entire studio. DICE's reputation has taken some serious hits in recent years, not only from the Battlefield franchise, external from that as well. And with Battlefield 5 they took another solid punch. But they've had multiple chances to make up for their mistakes over the last 12 months, and unfortunately, they've taken very few of those chances. Now, like I said at the beginning, this decade has been one of highs and lows for the Battlefield franchise. We started off with an extremely positive outlook with Bad Company 2 and Battlefield 3. We took a little bit of a hit in the middle with Battlefield 4, but things did improve, and Hardline unfortunately just wasn't what the community was really looking for. They came swinging back in the third quarter with Battlefield 1, but at the end, we got knocked to the floor with Battlefield 5. To be ending the decade on such a low point for Battlefield, as a longtime fan, that hurts me. I don't want Battlefield to be in the position that it is, considering we've experienced the other positions in the last 10 years that have been far, far greater. Battlefield 5 is not the end to the decade that Battlefield as a franchise deserved. But I do firmly believe that Battlefield 5 is the result of having to create something to fill a gap. There's no way that after the masterpiece that was Battlefield 1 that a similarly staffed DICE team at the beginning could have done so poorly with Battlefield 5. With more time, I think the game could have been completely different, but unfortunately, that's not what happened, and the situation we're in has kind of clouded the rest of the awesomeness that has been Battlefield in this decade. There have been some truly incredible moments, and it's just such a shame that we're ending the decade at such a point. I'm hopeful that moving into the next decade, that Battlefield can start strongly again. Franchise design director Dan Berlin, one of the core developers who worked on Battlefield 1, is currently working on an unannounced project. And when you're the Battlefield franchise design director, then you can be pretty confident that that unannounced project is a Battlefield game. We won't see what that project is until at least 2021. We've got another year and a bit of Battlefield 5 to go first, so if there was ever a time that DICE needed to deliver a home run swing, it's when we move into the next decade with the Battlefield franchise. Thanks very much for watching, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.